Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we've got eClass 3 in Module 2. This is Social Work and Social Systems. You have one more eClass in this module, eClass 4, which is going to go over material in Chapter 4 and give you an overview of what's going to be on the quiz. To start, I'd like to give you an overview of what's going to be in today's eClass. We're going to go over the learning objectives for this module. We're going to go through a review question. This is to help give you an idea of what's going to be on the quiz. We're going to go over the reading review, briefly cover the ecological perspective, levels of practice, systems theory, and we're going to go over an application of ecological perspective and systems theory that social workers use a lot. This is the eco map. By the end of this class, I hope you'll have a better understanding of the concept of person and environment and how it informs our social work practice. Hope you'll be able to identify and explain the different levels of social work practice, and be able to identify and explain key aspects of systems theory and ecological perspective. Before we get into the material, I want to have you do a review question from previous readings. So the key elements in the common base of social work practice include A. Theory, policy, and research. B. Values, knowledge, and skills. C. Theories, ethics, and skills. Or D. Knowledge, ethics, and advocacy. Take a minute and write down your answer. When you're ready, go on to the next slide so you can see if you got the correct answer. If you selected B. Values, knowledge, and skills, that's the correct answer. Now, while we engage in theory, policy, and research, and we use values and ethics to guide our practice, these aren't our common base of social work practice. The values, the knowledge, and skills, these are the key foundation for social work practice. This is one of my favorite sayings, and you heard me talk about it a little bit in eClass 1. Because I think there's a misperception that it's sometimes made about social work. It's important to recognize that social work practice is grounded in a knowledge base. We use theory and research as well as the client's perspective to guide our practice. And the profession is guided by 6 core values that accompany ethical standards and principles. And social workers are trained to have a particular skill set to be effective in working with individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities. So we're not making choices because it seems like the nice thing to do, or, I just want to do something that's helpful. Our choices, the way we approach practice, how we work with clients are all grounded in more than simple notions of being nice or helpful. And while we certainly do aim to work with compassion and in the spirit of service, we really come to that with this knowledge base. We make sure our practice fits within the values of social work, and we use the skills that we learn both as social workers in the classroom and that we develop throughout our careers. Okay. These are some of the key terms and ideas that you should be familiar with from the reading. Ecosystems perspective and key terms, systems theory and key terms, the concept of person and environment, the idea of transactions, or what I'll call energy in later slides, environmental press, the levels of practice, so micro level, meso level, and macro level, and the ideas of casework, group work, and community organization. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the ecological perspective, in part because I think it will help in your understanding of the levels of practice, and then we'll talk more about systems theory and in eco maps in more depth later in this e-class. So the ecological perspective and systems theories describe an individual's functioning when considering the context of their environment. So rather than considering the problems people face to stem only from within, so internal problems, the ecological and systems theories explain difficulties by looking at interactions with the environment. And so what we really focus on when we talk about the ecological perspective is these transactions across these different levels. In other words, the person in their environment, which is a really key and focal idea of social work, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that next. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about the ecological perspectives, where it came from, and the different levels. So the ecological perspective, as its name implies, was really developed from key ideas in ecology. And these ideas were that organisms interact with each other in their environment. They interact with all aspects of their environment. So thinking about, a tree interacts with the soil, it interacts with the sun, uh, air, wind, rain, all of these things. So we're not just, when we talk about the ecological perspective, ecological systems, we're not talking solely about an individual or one unique organism. We're talking about their fit in their environment. And so the ecological perspective, as it's applied and used in social work, is most often associated with the work of Bronfenbrenner. And he discussed ecological perspective really from the framework of child development by identifying the microsystem, mesosystem, ecosystem, macrosystem, and while you don't see it here, there's another level to his system, and that's the chronosystem. And so we're going to take a moment and just talk a little bit about what is in each of them. So the microsystem is closest to the client. For a child, this would include parents, siblings, peers, and teachers. And understanding the systems that exert the most influence on the client is essential to social work practice when taking an ecological systems approach. And again, we're going to talk more about how you look at the influences of these different aspects or different systems that affect an individual in the later slides. But just understand now kind of these key terms. So the microsystem, it looks at the individual as well as kind of the immediate influences on the individual's life. The mesosystem refers to the relationships or direct interactions among systems in the microsystem, and the mesosystem demonstrates the importance of the interactional nature of systems. So social workers commonly look at whether relationships among systems help or hinder the growth and development of a client. For example, child welfare workers commonly look at the relationships between children and their parents to assess whether the interaction is supporting healthy child development. And so as you can see, the microsystem and the mesosystem overlap quite a bit. Often in other representations, you may actually see them collapsed because the boundaries between them aren't entirely clear. What you really need to think about for this class is that the microsystem and the mesosystem are really looking at these interactions between the individual and their immediate environments. Next, we've got the exosystem, and this is occurring when an interaction between two systems exerts an indirect influence on another system. So imagine that a supervisor at a social service organization is being reprimanded by the agency director for not meeting the agency's goal regarding how many hours his program would bill for that month. The supervisor might put pressure on his supervisees to increase the number of billable hours because of the pressure exerted by his superior. Although the effect is coming from a higher level, the social workers never had communication with the agency director about the need to increase billable hours. Another example involves a mother experiencing stress at work because of a new computer system. When she comes home and is short with her children, the children are affected even though they have no formal relationship with their mother's employer. So again, the exosystem is something that you might say is kind of once removed from the child's or the individual's immediate interactions. So, the larger environmental context, the neighborhoods, for example, say the child's family lives in a food desert and cannot access fresh groceries, healthy meals, and things like that. So that neighborhood context influences the family, which influences the child. Again, this is the kind of idea of these, we're slowly kind of building out into the larger systems that can influence an individual client, or if you're working with a family, that client system. So then we have the macro system, and this is a larger system that influences the client's life. Macro systems could include the US healthcare system. They could include a client's culture, which defines beliefs and beliefs and practices that inform their daily living. It could be part of or they could be receiving services from an entitlement program, such as food stamps or Medicaid or something like that. That would all be a kind of the larger macro system, which directly then influences the micro system. Right, and then the last one, which isn't pictured here in this in this image of Bronfenbrenner's system, is the chrono system. And so this is the events that affect the client. So thinking, as the name suggests, larger historical trends, larger events. So thinking about the time and place and how these ideas could shape or impact your client. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as we talked about before with ableism, those who were born before the passing of the ADA have had different life experiences than those who were born after the passage of the ADA, when there have been some more protections. So that'd be the idea of the chrono system, or the changing attitudes, if we think kind of socially about people with disabilities, how we've gone from institutionalizing them to wanting them to be active and engaged members of the community. Those are kind of examples of the chronos system. Okay, and you heard me mention it in the previous slide, the idea of the person and environment. And the person environment perspective it's informed by both systems and ecological, systems theory and ecological perspective. And it's really a foundational base of social work practice. The National Association of Social Workers, the NASW, which is the professional organization that defines social work's missions and ethical standards, refers to the field's commitment to this perspective in the preamble of our Code of Ethics. And so and this states that a historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of society. So fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. And an important thing to think about when we're thinking about person and environment, when we think about environmental press and things like that, is an individual's, the goodness of fit for the individual with their environment. So if an environment is well suited to meet the needs of an individual, this can lead to growth. If it's not, this can really lead to barriers and oppression. For example, again, I'm going to draw on disabilities because I think that can help exemplify and give you a tangible image of what this could look like. So an individual who uses a wheelchair, and goodness of fit with their environment would mean that if there are stairs in buildings, then there are also usable ramps, elevators, that door widths are wide enough to accommodate their wheelchair, that they don't have to go too far to get into buildings, there's accessible parking and things like that. That would allow the individual to really live and engage in their environment without really experiencing any barriers. However, if they live in an environment that isn't a good fit, as you can see in the picture here, this might mean that, for example, there are stairs and no ramps, no elevators. They can't get into buildings. They can't use buildings, for example, places of employment, things like that. So the environment, and this could be anything, again, not just these more concrete examples of stairs versus ramps. This could be anything from meeting a person's emotional needs, meeting their social needs, It's really about whether or not the environment it supports whatever your client needs in order to grow and move up and kind of um, move towards that self-actualization, move towards feeling like they are accomplished and they have a purpose in life and they are able to fulfill it. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about the ecological perspective and the systems level that we use kind of to inform our practice, how we look at not just individuals, but their interactions with the environments and the transactions that occur. Let's also look at how ecological and systems level ideas kind of influence the structure of practice itself. And so in social work, we have several levels of practice. Now, I've already talked about them off and on in terms of micro, meso, and macro level practice. So let's take a moment and just look at these a little bit deeper and see what kind of social work interventions or what kind of jobs you might be involved in if you worked at these different levels. So at the micro level, as we've discussed, you'd be involved with individuals, families, and small groups. And the type of work or the type of interventions that you do at this level could vary greatly depending on the organizational setting you're in, the mission of your organization, and things like that, which we're going to actually talk a little bit more about in eClass 4. But some of the things you could be involved in, for example, might be therapy. So if you decide to go the clinical route, go on and get your MSW, you could become a licensed clinical social worker where you actually provide therapy and services to individuals, families, and groups. At the BSW level and at the MSW level, you're often involved in casework with individuals and families. And this could look like helping an individual or family navigate a particular system. So, for example, if you work for an organization that helps individuals find housing, you may be working with individuals doing intakes and referrals, helping them get access to housing vouchers, helping them apply for services or reductions in the cost of services, such as heating and cooling, things like that. You may also be involved in running groups, and this could be groups of individuals, anything from helping mothers with postpartum depression. It could be helping individuals who have substance use and are trying to stay in recovery. There are any number of things that you could do with groups. You could be a school social worker and you could run an after-school group for students to combat bullying, for example. There are a lot of different types of work you can do at the micro level, just depending on your organization and your focus. Next, we've got the meso level, and this is really working with formal groups. And in this case, they say complex communities. Meso level is often not well defined. You can see, it kind of shares distinctions both with the micro level and the macro level. And so really, I tend to think of meso level social work as working with kind of bigger groups, as well, for example, neighborhoods or more complex systems than you would maybe necessarily work at the micro level, but less complex or less big than you would work with at the macro level. However, again, the definition of meso and what's included and not included varies a lot. There's no real clear-cut definition within social work. So you'll probably often hear people talking about macro social work, and they could just be talking about working with groups or organizations. You could hear people just talk about micro social work and be talking about working with groups. Again, one of the nice things about social work is it is flexible, which means that if you have an interest in working with groups, you can find a variety of organizations and opportunities. If you just want to work with individuals, there are a plethora of opportunities within the field of social work. Right? And the last one, macro and macro level intervention. So we're talking kind of bigger groups and societies as a whole. So this might often we think about macro practice as policy practice, but it doesn't have to just be that. It can be community organizing, and so you may actually be using kind of the meso macro skills to do community organizing. You may actually help develop coalitions to tackle issues. So you may, for example, bring in leaders from a number of churches and other community organizations to tackle issues such as food deserts in your community or neighborhood violence or to get grants to build a new community center. All of those things, again, are kind of more macro level practice, but they also include some meso and some micro level elements. So again, we talk about generalist social work, and the reason we really harp on that is because as social workers, we may kind of specialize or have our focus in one area, but in truth, we really know how to work at all levels, and we think about all levels of practice as we're working. So we recognize even if we want to be a licensed clinical social worker, that the therapy we're doing, if we're working with women who are victims of domestic violence, we know that this isn't just an isolated incident, that there's a larger system that contributes to domestic violence. And it could be anything from in the community, there are a lack of jobs or other things like that. There aren't enough shelters to protect the women. There aren't enough resources to help them transition out of those situations. All the way up to the kind of federal level with policy in terms of how we are implementing such federal policies as the Violence Against Women's Act, whether or not we are upholding the key ideas of that, whether or not we're funding that properly so that all the way down to the people that we work with, that there are organizations and agencies that we can help get the people we're working with connected with those so they can get out of those situations. So again, just like we talked about in the previous class with the waterfall and river, social workers, no matter what level we're working at, we always have to keep in mind the different levels of practice because the interventions that we do at the macro level have implications all the way down to the micro level and vice versa. So now that we've talked about kind of the bigger picture, what ecological looks like with the micro, meso, exo, and macro systems, as well as the Chronos system, let's dive a little bit deeper into systems theory so that we can really understand the foundation of the ecological perspective and how we use systems theory and ecological perspective together to really help guide our practice. So in systems theory, the idea is everything is connected. Every individual is connected to other individuals, to their environments. Nothing really exists or works in isolation. So systems are made up of interrelated members or parts that constitute an ordered whole. So you can think of it as an system is really an organized entity that's made up of interrelated and interdependent parts. Each part of the system impacts all other parts and the larger system as a whole. So as individuals, we impact each other, we impact the environments that we work in, that we go to school in, and those systems also impact us. All systems are subsystems of larger systems. So you as an individual are a system, and you are a subsystem of this class, which is a subsystem of the College of Health and Human Services Social Work Department, which is a subsystem within the UNCW system, so on and so forth. Okay. Another important thing to remember is that systems maintain boundaries that give them their identity. So barriers that define a system and distinguish it from other systems in the environment is another way to think about this. So the School of Social Welfare or Social Work at UNCW, we're distinct and we have our own boundaries compared to nursing, for example. We have our own degree requirements and things like that. Now, there are also dynamic interactions within a system, between systems, and among systems that produce stability and change. As we'll talk about the next slide, systems have a tendency to try to maintain the status quo and have stability. However, there are things that come in and impact a system. So, for example, if you're a social worker working at an agency, right, that's your system. You may get a new boss, or there may be funding changes that actually have you implement a whole new type of therapy, or totally change the way you practice with clients, things like that, which would force your system to actually change rapidly and dramatically in order to meet those new requirements that the larger system is imposing on your subsystem. Okay, so let's go over some of the specifics. A system is a set of elements that are orderly, interrelated, and functional as a whole. So examples of this could be an individual. So I'm a system. I'm made up of a skeletal system, a muscular system, a digestive system. Or it could be a family. A family is made up of smaller subsystems, just like I was in the last example. So a family is the system. The subsystem is the mom, the dad, the two children, etc. A social service department could also be a system. So the subsystem there maybe is the department, and there's that department. North Carolina itself can be a system. And you've got the smaller subsystems, the counties within it, and in each of those examples there was a larger system to be considered, as well as the various subsystems. Now let's talk about the idea of boundaries. Boundaries are borders or margins that separate one entity from another. So an example here is a membership of a club that grants privileges to only one group of members. So let's say that you're a member of the YMCA and you get a discount off yoga, for example. Because you're a member, well, there's the boundary between you and other folks who don't get that discount because of your membership in that system. And so a subsystem, as I mentioned, is a smaller subordinate system within a larger system. So for instance, the College of Health and Human Services is a subsystem of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And next, let's talk about homeostasis. So homeostasis is a tendency for a system to maintain relatively stable, constant balance. So this is, for example, if this is a community elects officials who have similar beliefs about societal issues in order to maintain a level of stability. So not much is going to change. Things are going to stay pretty much the same. Okay, then we also have the idea of role. So roles are culturally expected behavioral patterns for a person. Having a specified status or being involved in a designated social relationship. So for instance, a mayor assumes the role of decision maker. So there are a couple key concepts and definitions that are also important when understanding systems theory. These include relationships, which is the dynamic connection between two or more persons or systems that involves how they think about, feel about, and behave toward each other. So, for example, a social worker has a relationship with her supervisor. Their communication and interaction helps to maximize the social worker's effectiveness. Systems also have input, so energy, information, or communication flow that's received from other systems. And systems have outputs, so what happens to the input after it's gone through and been processed by some system. So for example, if we've got Pablo mentoring Astrid, Pablo puts in time, energy, knowledge, and skills, expertise, they work together, and as this information is processed and worked through, the output is that Astrid gets a job. Now, this input and output can include negative feedback or positive feedback. And negative feedback is, this is a special form of input where system receives information about the system's own performance. So, for example, Boris alerts Natasha that her children have been playing in the street, a dangerous situation, in the hopes that Natasha's children will avoid the street from now on, in an attempt to correct the behavior. So again, this negative feedback is reflecting the system's performance. So trying to encourage Natasha to take steps to make sure that her children aren't playing out in a dangerous situation. And positive feedback, this is the informational input a system receives about what it's doing correctly in order to maintain itself and thrive. So an employee is given a raise on the basis of excellent performance. So behaviors that would encourage the employee to maintain that behavior or work even harder. So for example, I encourage you all to do the reading in the hopes that by doing the reading and processing that information, it will help you succeed on the quizzes. So now that we've talked about the ecological perspective, you've seen kind of the bigger picture in terms of the levels. We've talked about systems theory. Let's bring the two together and kind of synthesize some of those key ideas. So a system consists of interrelated and interdependent parts. So a system is a set of components that are related to one another, often to accomplish a common purpose. If we think about it in terms of our body representing a system, it's because it's a whole that depends on the functioning of several interrelated parts that work to sustain life. Again, a family is a system that's formed through biological, social, or both types of connections and consists of related parts. And now if we want to go bigger and think of kind of a social service organization, for example, we might have a health organization consisting of an inpatient program and an outpatient program. And each of these programs is a subsystem of the larger system. So the larger system being the health organization. Because they're part of the larger organization, subsystems are related to one another through the common purpose and policies of the overall system. And subsystems also depend on one another. So, for example, an inpatient and an outpatient program may make referrals back and forth. In addition, if the inpatient program is being used to its full capacity, the excess funding generated from this program could be used to offset the outpatient programming when it's being less used and underfunded. So again, these systems are interrelated and interdependent parts that again are connected, both subsystems connected to each other, as well as having transactions with the larger systems. Boundaries are important to understanding ecological perspective and systems theory because boundaries determine the degree to which a system is separated from its environment. So a closed system allows nothing to come in or out of the system, whereas an open system allows input and output so that there's a transaction with the environment surrounding the system. Closed systems are really problematic in that they allow no feedback to the system, so no opportunities for growth. However, systems with loose boundaries may be so open that the connections making a system become lost. And so the idea or the boundaries that defined the individual or the organization are so loose that it loses its identity and loses its purpose. And so when one way we can think about this is, for example, family therapists, when they're working with families, they really like to see firm yet flexible boundaries. Those are kind of the ideals. So in this way, there are clear boundaries, but there's kind of give and take because it's an open system, but not too open, so that feedback can come in and out of the system to accommodate the changing family needs. So again, too loose of boundaries means that there are no rules, there are no guiding principles for the kids in that family, for example. There may be no discipline, things like that. Whereas too firm of boundaries means that the parents might be too strict, which would stifle the child's growth and development. So the ideal being within a family system of these firm yet flexible boundaries. So clear sets of rules and expectations for everyone in the family, but with the flexibility to adapt and change as environments and needs change. And so why boundaries and rules are ideal for families, not just because they set up these expectations, they also help to kind of define and create a sense of predictability that really allows the system to function effectively. So systems theory suggests that entities have boundaries and rules that govern a system, and this helps the system to achieve homeostasis, a drive that resists change and instead seeks to maintain a status quo. Interestingly, ecological theory, however, asserts that entities have a tendency towards adaptation, making the changes needed to protect themselves and grow to accomplish their goals. So ideally, our systems have, kind of these firm yet flexible boundaries that give us some predictability, some repetition, some clear understanding, but that we can also adapt these as needed to fit changing contexts and changing environments. Fourth, we've got the idea that a system is more than the sum of its parts. So considering that a system is a set of interrelated and interdependent parts, it would seem that the parts add up to a sum of its elements, right? But the idea that a system is more than the sum of its parts takes into account dynamics that occur among the parts of a system and increase the complexity of a system. This idea that, for example, when people come together to form a family, they actually form something beyond just the idea of a family, right? It's not just two people coming together. What develops and what emerges are patterns, beliefs, ideals, dreams, things like that. And the ongoing interactions really help to make up the unique family system. So, for example, a family system consisting of a grandmother, Judy, and her 5 grandchildren is more than just 6 people. It includes the relationships, the parts of the system, that each individual has with each other. It includes the boundaries and rules that govern the behavior of the individuals within the family. It also is affected by the environment. So in this example, this could include Judy's relationship with her son, who might be the father of the children. So for example, Judy's financial situation, because she cannot put her grandchildren on her medical insurance, and societal influences which lack resources for grandparents raising grandchildren could really influence the system and make things more complicated than just Judy taking care of her grandkids. Next, we've got the idea that changing one part of a system affects the other parts and the system as a whole. So the relationships between people and their environments are described as transactional and reciprocal. Essentially, the interconnections among entities are not linear, and where one entity affects the other. Instead, exchanges among systems bring about changes to one another over time. So consider the American healthcare system, which functions primarily through the use of insurance. When insurance companies fail to approve a needed health service, the insurance company affects the life of that patient, and social workers may become involved to advocate for the basic needs, to make sure the basic needs of that individual are met. However, consider the reciprocal nature of these relationships. When other insurers on the same plan seek medical treatment that is not needed or fill prescriptions that they do not intend to take, resources from the system are depleted. So some people may see these practices as hurting an insurance company with which they are unhappy. However, irresponsible use of insurance benefits affects others who are insured by that company, and that the resources available for their care may become more limited, or their insurance premiums may increase. And finally, back to the idea of person and environment, thinking about goodness of fit between a person and their environment. A goodness of fit between the needs, rights, capacities, and aspirations of individuals or groups on the one hand, and the qualities of their socio-cultural and physical environment on the other, involves some degree of meshing, which may be described as favorable, minimally adequate, or unfavorable. So again, as we talked about with a person with a disability, how well does the environment meet their needs? In the example we gave, we really talked about it just in terms of their physical needs. What about, as we talked about with ableism, their kind of socio-emotional needs? So for example, not being stared at, being treated with respect, and things like that. So the environment again can encompasses not just physical structures, but cultural structures and social structures as well. Now to kind of see how some of these things might play out in practice, I've got a case study that I'd like you to work through. So we have Roberto, a 15-year-old Latino, who's in juvenile detention because of a recent incident in which he was arrested for selling marijuana at school. You're Roberto's social work manager, and you're responsible for meeting with him and coming up with a plan to help him through the rehabilitation process. And your boss tells you that you need to sit down and talk with Roberto and follow an person and environment approach to really learn and understand Roberto's situation. So learning about his family, their life, and their life in the community. So I want you to think through these questions, and after you've while you're working through those, pause the video. Once you're ready, hit play again and go on to the next slide, and we'll talk through them a little bit. Now, there aren't really any right or wrong answers in this case. This is just a chance for you to really think about the different levels, micro, meso, exo, macro, chrono, how they could be influencing Roberto, and what it might look like if you were really to work with him, and what an intervention at the micro level could really look like. So again, pause this video while you write down your answers to some of these questions. And when you're ready, go on to the next slide, and I'll just give you some examples of possibilities. So as a caseworker working with Roberto, one of the things to think about is, is he a voluntary or an involuntary client? In this case, because he's in the juvenile justice system, he's probably involuntary, which means he's probably being forced to meet with you in order to either transition out of juvenile detention and things like that. So it's important to think about kind of where our clients are at as we start the relationship, because building rapport with Roberto may be a bit challenging since he's really not necessarily there by choice. However, he does probably have the motivation of getting out of detention and getting back to his family. So as a social worker, you can work with that. So some questions that you could ask Roberto, you might start with just really building that rapport. What's his family like? Does he, what's he looking forward to doing with them? You might start with those before you then get into kind of the more central questions to this issue of, why is he selling marijuana? Because getting the bigger, broader picture about Roberto and his family life is probably going to give you a pretty good idea of why he's selling marijuana. All right. So again, as a social worker, working with an individual at the micro level, you're really working on building that rapport and understanding the individual's life and circumstances. And so again, we also want to be looking at Roberto's strengths. So what are his goals? Does he have a goal of going on to college? Is it graduating high school so that he can then get a job to support his family? Does he, does he have any talents or skills that maybe he's not getting to use? Maybe he's bored in school, things like that, that really could help you understand the situation. Maybe he, really wants to be an IT programmer. He's watches tons of YouTube videos, but the computer department or there really aren't any computers or opportunities to do that at his high school. All of these different things can play in, and it's important not to let necessarily our preconceptions of why Roberto might be selling marijuana cloud what's actually going on. So again, the questions you might ask start broad and general. How's he doing? Build that rapport. What are his goals? And how's his family life, which is going to get you into those micro level questions. So what's his relationship with his parents, what's his relationship like with his siblings, if he has any, what's his relationship like with his friends, is he just selling on a whim to seem cool to his friends, or was he trying to help a friend out, things like that. So really exploring those kind of micro level aspects. Then you also want to explore the community level. So again, going back to the example of the school being underfunded. So it doesn't have the programs necessarily that Roberto needs to keep him interested or focused. So what can you do to help him with that? Or it may be, for example, that he's selling to help support his family because his father just got laid off, money's tight, things like that. So, maybe you need to look at the employment situation and options for Roberto's father and his family to help with that. And so again, looking at these different levels, looking at Roberto not just as an individual who committed a crime, but looking at understanding who he is as a person, what his goals are, what his talents are, the circumstances that led him to being in this situation, and how you can get out of it can really help develop a more solid intervention plan. So what might the micro intervention look like? Well, again, it kind of depends on what we found out from Robert. So let's go example one, being that he just wanted to fit in with his peers, right? So he wanted to look cool, that kind of thing. So then maybe we talk about, well, what are your long-term goals? And, is this friend network really going to help you do that? If you want to go to college, are these friends supporting you doing that? Do they care more about, do their goals and their hopes line up with yours? So you may have to, walk with him through that and help him maybe make a transition to connecting with a mentor who could be kind of more regular in his life or something like that to help him, or finding a new support friendship network. Things like that could help. All right, example two, let's say, again, his school doesn't have the educational programs and computer software and things like that he wants and needs. He's bored. Okay, so he's already watching YouTube videos on programming and things like that. So can we get him connected with some online folks online, get him into almost, so you're probably familiar with various support groups and things like that. So we might look at this another way and say, can we get Roberto in with an IT support group in a way, right? Can we get him connected with people online who could mentor him and help him develop those skills? Again, as a social worker, he is younger and vulnerable, so we need to make sure that these are safe spaces for him to be in. But maybe we could connect him, maybe Google or something like that has mentorship programs for kids aspiring to become programmers, things like that. So how can we connect him with those resources that are going to help him, even though his school is, not engaging him as much as he wants? All right, example three. What might this micro level intervention look like if, for example, his father's lost his job and Roberto is selling to help support the family. So this gets a little more complicated because then we may need to do a family level intervention. We may need to talk with the family about what's going on. We may want to either talk to his father or help his father connect with employment resources to get another job. We may talk through some strategies with the family so that Roberto can help in other ways within the family to take the strain off the family, maybe watching his younger sister when he gets home from school so that his mom can do a part-time job or something, something like that. So what is it, how within the family can we work through that? Okay, and then let's do a final example. The case where, Roberto is selling just to sell. He may be doing it simply because, he wants the money, something like that. Again, you may be looking at the individual, talking through, what are your options? What are your goals? Is this going to get you there? Looking at the meso level, you know, what is the economic environment of the community he's in? Um, are there other options where he could make money? He could work part-time jobs that would be safer in terms of getting arrested and things like that, and that would interest him. So again, thinking through all of these different things. What's Roberto's motivation? Why did he get to where he's at? Where does he want to go? And what resources and supports can you leverage to really help him get to that end goal? So again, that's just kind of an example of the different, using kind of the eco and systems perspectives and theories onto kind of how we'd look at Roberto's situation in real life. Again, we're not necessarily talking about each of those terms in systems theory or ecological. So when we're working with clients, it's really important not to use that jargon, not to use the kind of academic lingo, because that doesn't make a lot of sense to our clients, but instead to use these theories, these ideas. So for example, again, Roberto helping out with his sister. So that might now become a rule within the family. Or, maybe there aren't good communication levels within Roberto's family, and that's why he went out and started selling, and maybe his parents didn't know about it because they weren't talking. He could see they were stressed. He was trying to help out. So how do you renegotiate those relationships and transactions within the family? All of these things are things that you as a social worker could work on with Roberto and his family. I mean, the possibilities are kind of infinite, depending on his situation, his family circumstances, and things like that. But again, this is just to give you an example of what it would look like to look at Roberto as a person in his environment. Up next, make sure you complete the social work stance activity. Remember, write down your thoughts and feelings as you complete these e-classes and these activities, as it'll make it easier for you to complete the journal. Next week, you're going to have e-class 4, the quiz, and you're going to be turning in journal 1.